In a time before cordite, before the first gun cotton, before the ironclad, before even the first naval shell, there was the time of the dinosaurs. Okay, maybe we're not going quite that far back, but we are talking about the start of the 19th century, when naval warfare was still firmly rooted in the same basic formula that had dominated the high seas for the past couple hundred years. Big wooden ship, filled with lots of cannon, firing solid lumps of iron at each other. This could put many holes in the opposing ship, but although a few of them would be low enough down to let water in, and these could be a major problem, the colanderization of the enemy was statistically largely confined to the upper areas of the hull, as well as the masts, rigging, and any crewman unlucky enough to get in the way. Ships were of course made of wood, which with very few exceptions tends to be buoyant, which combined to mean that sinking the ship as a result of gunfire, i.e. direct enemy action, was actually a very rare event. It could still happen, of course. Ballast, supplies, and the ship's armament, amongst other things, meant that even a wooden ship was overall dense enough to sink if you let enough water in. Just ask the crew of the Mary Rose. But equally, you could let a truly worrying amount of water into a wooden ship, and it would just sit slightly lower in the water. The Jesus of Lubeck, on its final voyage to the Americas before it was sunk by the Spanish, was at one point noted to have gaps in her planking that were so large that the ballast holds were essentially contiguous with the ocean around the ship, to the extent that one inspecting man went down and found that there were reasonably sized fish swimming through these spaces. Thus, of the ships that sank in battle, most tended to be destroyed by secondary effects such as fires or magazine explosions, with one often being the cause of the other. From a naval perspective, this could be both good and bad. It meant that usually to subdue a ship you had to kill, or threaten with certain death, enough of the crew to force them to actually surrender, which meant that if you happened to have very stubborn and well-trained crews, your ships might last quite a while in battle. It also favoured larger and larger ships with more and more guns, which could dish out more damage faster and were harder to board because of their higher sides. And of course it also meant that a ship that was lost in battle had usually just changed hands, which meant if you'd lost the ship there was a chance of getting it back, and if you'd won the ship then it was kind of a two for the price of one deal, as you'd reduced the enemy fleet by one, but increased your own fleet by one as well, assuming your capture was worth repairing. And even if it wasn't, well, it was a free supply of guns, wood and rigging to repair and arm your other ships. But if you were on the losing side of a war, either because you were vastly outnumbered by your enemies, like the US Navy in the War of 1812, or the enemy just had a combat advantage that meant although you could build ships at a similar rate to them, they kept taking them off you, like France in the Napoleonic Wars, you might look for a more rapidly destructive option, something that could very quickly reduce the enemy's fleet strength, even if you didn't get to keep any of those ships yourself. A kind of last man standing is king approach. And even if you were on the side that happened to be the larger navy and usually the winning one, simply being able to delete your opponents in fairly short order might still prove somewhat attractive. And this is where we find ourselves at the outset of the invention of the torpedo. Now, to be clear, we're going to be looking at what is more properly the locomotive or self-propelled torpedo and its direct ancestors, i.e. explosive charges usually at the front of a thing that is supposed to go towards the enemy. At the time we start this account, torpedo was actually a far more general term for underwater explosives that also covered what we might today call limpet mines, sea mines, demolition charges, and various other more static devices. Their history is a history for another time. The idea of an underwater explosive charge was simple. Instead of letting air in the top of an already fairly buoyant target, you let water in the bottom, and a lot of it. Shots below the waterline with cannon were, as mentioned previously, a little bit of a problem, but even a 32-pounder shot would leave a hole considerably less than a foot across, which a ship's carpenter and their assistants would usually be able to patch up relatively quickly and easily, at least within reason. Conversely, a hole several feet or even over 10 feet wide would be almost impossible to patch for multiple reasons. Not just the much larger amount of material that would be needed to cover it, but also the much greater amount of water which would be entering, which would cut down on the time before the ship started to list quite considerably, and would also exert a great force on anybody who was trying to get close enough to stem the flow. Into this we enter Robert Fulton, an American. The Americans as a whole were not entirely new or adverse to the idea of blowing holes in the bottom of enemy ships. David Bushnell had tried to sink the ship of the line HMS Eagle using his hand-powered submarine Turtle during the US War for Independence. As the 18th century turned into the 19th, the US and France were engaged on a national level in the Quasi-War, but there was still some residual good feeling between the two nations as a result of France's assistance in the aforementioned War for Independence, at least on an individual level. And so Fulton sailed to France from, of all places, the UK, where he'd been living for a while, and he offered the French a submarine of his design to help in their war with the British. This vessel, named Nautilus, worked pretty well for a hand-cranked submarine built largely of wood, but in the end Napoleon was uninterested. Part of the problem was that to actually attack anything, you had to get the submarine physically in contact with the enemy ship and ram a spike into the underside of the hull. The submarine would then leave, towing an explosive charge behind it on a line that was threaded through the base of the spike. When the line ran out, the charge came into contact with the side of the hull and exploded. Essentially, this was a slightly safer variation on the Bushnell idea, but only slightly. Many thought the approach either suicidal or impractical, especially since the spike would have to be driven through the copper plating that practically all British warships had below the waterline. There was potential for use against merchant shipping, which usually didn't have copper plating on their hulls at this point, as this was a very expensive process, but with ultimate rejection, Fulton decided to head back to the UK and offer his services there instead. He was nothing if not a practical man. Pondering more effective methods of blowing ships up with underwater explosives, he developed a stealth catamaran that was armed with a variety of what would again be best described as floating mines. Attacks on French ports in 1804 and 1805 using a variety of his inventions turned out to be a little disappointing. Fulton realised that a relatively shallow explosion with a man-portable amount of gunpowder would largely result in a column of water alongside a ship and not much else. The explosive would have to go off deeper, ideally beneath the ship. To this end, he modified his latest setup, which had used a towed explosive on the end of a line, to one where the explosive charge was a little bit offset. Thus, any current would push the submerged device sideways against the ship with enough force hopefully to detonate it. The idea was to have two devices, one at each end of a long rope. The middle of that rope would then be towed towards the enemy ship, which would hopefully be at anchor, and the whole collection would then be launched, or floated out, such that the rope would then snag on the attacked ship's anchor cable, and the two ends begin to swing around. This actually worked quite spectacularly, destroying the test ship utterly. However, Nelson then had to go and ruin his fun by breaking the back of the Franco-Spanish fleet at Trafalgar just a week after his first successful test, and funding from the British, heretofore quite generous as they were rather interested in removing French ships from the high seas, dried up in the face of a, relatively speaking, lack of threat. Fulton then decided to go home and demonstrated an even more refined concept off of New York. He made the warheads quite negatively buoyant and hung them from small floats. This ensured they stayed at a lethal depth. Although America was not at war with anyone in 1807 when he showed off his inventions, he kept plugging away, trying to improve things. By 1810, he decided that floating the devices down onto the target and relying on the wind, waves and current was inaccurate and slow, and so he converted a blunderbuss into a gunpowder-based harpoon gun, thus allowing a small boat to fire said harpoon into the side of a target whilst it was passing by, with the explosive attached to a rope at the other end, which would then be set loose to devastating effect once it came in contact with the side of the enemy vessel. Then, of course, came the War of 1812, and Fulton's attention was diverted by a wide range of ideas for the defence of his home country. But relevant to us is that in 1813 he described the spar torpedo, which was essentially one of his previous warheads, but now on the end of a long pole that was suspended at or below the keel level of the attack craft. Whilst this required a slightly closer approach to the target than his previous rope or harpoon-based methods, it didn't require direct hull contact like his submarine did. The clockwork time fuses he used could also be employed if you could guarantee that the warhead would remain stuck in the target ship, and if not, then either a contact or lanyard-based detonator would need to be used, along with the hope that the pole was long enough to save your ship from the blast itself. In a case of great minds think alike, or someone cribbing notes from him, or Fulton actually helping some of the subsequent attempts out, which was certainly the case in one or two instances, the announcement by the US Congress that any private citizen who managed to destroy a British warship that was blockading a US port would be paid half the value of the sunken vessel resulted in a number of interesting efforts which were directed at various British warships. For some reason, the third-rate HMS Ramillies, flagship of the blockade of New London, was a favourite target, and at least one attempt by a low-lying craft armed with a spar torpedo is known to have been recorded, albeit the vessel in question was caught in a storm and driven ashore before it could reach the British fleet, with its wreck then being examined by a British landing party before they burnt it. With the War of 1812 over, with a few attacks that had managed to come close but failed to inflict major damage, the days of the spar torpedo would have to wait. That wait came to an end in 1863. The overall venue hadn't changed, as we're still in the United States, only now it was the American Civil War, and the Confederates launched the world's first successful spar torpedo attack with the semi-submersible steam-powered attack boat CSS David, which attacked the USS New Ironsides on the 5th of October, damaging but not sinking the Union Navy's only ironclad, which was both worthy of the name and not an especially angry raft. The world's first spar torpedo to successfully sink its target in wartime was deployed on the 17th of February 1864 by the hand-cranked submarine CSS Hunley, which managed to score a double kill by not only sinking USS Housatonic, but also fatally damaging itself with the blast, although she did manage to limp away some distance before going down, thus granting the Hunley the dubious distinction of a near 300% fatality rate against her own crew, as she'd been lost with almost all hands twice previously. To be entirely fair, Hunley's spar torpedo was supposed to stick the warhead in the target, then allow the sub to withdraw, and detonate the explosives at a safe distance via a lanyard. But the wreck, when it was discovered, showed that the warhead went off whilst it was still attached to the spar, and thus only 16 feet away from the front of the sub. Either thanks to a premature detonation, or possibly a failure of the warhead to release from the spar, which would have left the crew with a choice of either remaining stuck to the frigate, or chancing blowing the warhead with the lanyard and gambling on the submarine surviving the blast, which, to be fair, they almost managed. From this point on, spar torpedoes rapidly proliferated on both sides. The Union, however, decided to keep the deploying craft on the surface, mostly in the form of small boats, rather than partially or wholly underwater. Several Confederate ironclads were also reported to have been fitted with such weapons, which in theory would bypass most of the defences of the average Union monitor and ensure their swift demise if used correctly, as was seen when one or two Union monitors hit mines. That said, a Union launch armed with such a device managed to sink the CSS Albemarle, a Confederate ironclad, in late October 1864, and soon various navies across the world were adopting the spar torpedo and putting it to use. The Russians, under the then captain Makarov, would use a spar torpedo to sink the Ottoman monitor Sefi in May 1877. Subsequent attacks ordered by Makarov and commanded by one Lieutenant Rozesvensky failed, but the attacking crew managed to escape mostly intact. Then, in 1884, a pair of Chinese cruisers, a sloop, and a dispatch boat were all sunk by French spar torpedoes in the Sino-French War over what would become French Indochina, now largely Vietnam. Chinese attempts with their own spar torpedo boats to counterattack were foiled by the French use of the new electric searchlight, which rather highlighted the attack for counter-battery fire. The spar torpedoes would thus remain in service for a surprisingly long time, only really falling out of use in the very last years of the 19th century, although still remaining in some navies' arsenals a little bit beyond that. But even as the spar torpedo was finally seeing its first successful use over in the States, the genesis of what we think of today as the torpedo was taking root back in Europe. In Austria specifically, where a retired naval officer by the name of Giovanni de Lupis had come up with a small wooden clockwork-powered device that resembled a fared-over kayak or small boat. The idea was relatively simple. Explosives and a percussion fuse up front, an engine at the back, you pointed it at the target and let it go, with some steering theoretically possible by means of control lines which would be connected to the launching installation or ship. To develop the idea into something a little bit more workable, the clockwork drive was short range and so slow and low power that the weapon could be fended off with a particularly long stick, he went to visit Robert Whitehead, a naval engineer who'd previously worked in France, then in Italy, and was currently working in Fiume for Austria. The partnership didn't last long, foundering in part because the surface-running nature of the weapon allowed the target time to spot and engage it. Plus, the thickest armour of most ships at this point was at the waterline, and with air to vent the explosion, most of the explosive charge would be wasted hitting a ship at this level. However, Whitehead latched onto the general concept of an unmanned self-propelled explosive weapon, but he realised that if it could be made to approach underwater, then counters or evasion would be very limited, as well as the effect of the explosion itself being able to largely bypass a ship's protection and being more contained by having a bunch of water above it. By 1866, he developed a new prototype device made of steel, shaped like a pointed cigar, and with substantial vertical and horizontal fins, presumably to help with stabilization. The problem with anything that moved underwater was, of course, depth keeping. Left to its own devices, even the most well-balanced neutrally buoyant torpedo would, with the effect of waves, currents, and so forth, inevitably either head for the surface and start to porpoise, breaching time and time again, which would allow it to become visible, cut down on its range, and quite probably send it off course, or it would plunge into the depths, either to explode on contact with the seabed or hit crush depth, depending on the depth of the water it was in. To counter this, he installed what we would today call a hydrostatic valve. This is essentially a plate that pushed on a rod that was connected to a weighted pendulum and a control arm, which was in turn connected to a set of horizontal guidance fins. This was the great secret of the Whitehead torpedo. The control fins would be arranged in such a way that at a certain depth the plate's position, pushed in by the pressure, would have the fins level and the pendulum set vertically downwards. Thus, if the torpedo rose above the target depth and the pressure reduced, the plate would move outwards, the fins would move downwards, and the torpedo would dive. If the torpedo went below a depth that it was intended, then the plate would be pushed in by the increased pressure, the fins would be moved up, and the torpedo would rise. Now, on its own, that would result in a very violent and increasingly more violent sinusoidal movement centered on the target depth. The pendulum was the key, as its weight damped this down. It provided a varying counterforce pulling back against the effect of the control mechanism. The greater the angle, of course, the greater the pull, and this meant that corrections happened with longer, smoother curves and became increasingly more precise closer to the target depth, which helped to keep everything steady. At this stage, the torpedo stayed heading in the right direction, primarily by means of its longitudinal stability and a finely calibrated preset vertical rudder, which required each torpedo, before it was dispatched to the customer, to be tested and retested multiple times, with the rudder ever increasingly refined as to its exact location per torpedo, and then you had to hope nobody knocked it in the interim. Powered by compressed air forced through a reciprocating engine, the long guidance fins on the body also doubled up as guidance rails, as the entire torpedo was supposed to be hung in a launch cage in the water, spun up to speed and then released, the fins-rails being set into notches in the cage. They also tripled up as stability controls to guard against the rolling that was caused by the torque of the propeller. By the end of the 1860s, after a few trials with steadily improving versions, the Austrian Navy ordered some, but financial restrictions meant that buying exclusive rights, including control of the depth-keeping secret, was beyond their means. In 1869, therefore, the Royal Navy bought the rights, along with a contract which allowed the Royal Arsenal in Woolwich to improve on the design, as long as those improvements were shared back with Whitehead for his own use. Thus, in 1874, they developed the contra-rotating propeller, eliminating much of the need for the extensive guidance fins attached to the body, resulting in a slightly pointier version of what we would recognise as a modern torpedo today. The high-pressure air flasks needed for increasingly large and powerful torpedoes kept Whitehead in business apart from direct sales of torpedoes and manufacturing licenses, since this specialised field of high-pressure air flask technology was something that many nations would continue to struggle with in the late 19th century, so even if they could build their own torpedoes, they still had to come back to Whitehead for the flasks. The 1870s would see the Whitehead deployed in action for the first time, along with the arrival of a competitor, the kite torpedo, invented by Captain Harvey of the Royal Navy. This worked in a manner somewhat similar to a paravane. It was deployed in pairs, with one streaming out on either side of the ship, but towed some distance behind it, unlike a paravane. The idea was to pass an enemy ship, and the line between you and the torpedo would catch on the target hull. Thus, as you advanced and hauled the line towards you, it would bring the charge into contact with the enemy ship as it was pulled along. This worked well, at least in theory, and was much cheaper than a Whitehead torpedo. In an era where ramming was popular, the Harvey torpedo also saw popularity in some navies as a defence against and supplement to the naval ram attack specifically. The idea on the defensive was that if you managed to dodge the ramming ship, then it would be struck as it passed your stern by the towed torpedo on the relevant side. Whereas if you were on the offensive, if you were the ramming ship and you missed, then you'd drag one of your own torpedoes into the enemy ship as you passed them by. However, the relatively fixed close distance, the need for long-term deployment during battle, and the post-fact nature of contact meant the far more flexible Whitehead, even if it was more expensive, remained the more popular and widespread weapon. Whitehead's torpedoes would see their first use at the Battle of Pacocha, where the rebel Peruvian ironclad Huascar was pursued by the large unarmoured frigate HMS Shah and the smaller wooden corvette HMS Amethyst in response to Huascar's looting of British merchant ships. Unfortunately, the shallower draft of the small ironclad meant that it simply retreated into shallow water, and a long-distance gun duel commenced. The Huascar proved singularly incapable of hitting all that much at range, with its limited number of slow-firing guns, and so it occasionally emerged to try to ram. Whilst the British put in a relatively creditable performance, getting about a 14% hit rate with their far more numerous guns, which ended up firing about 430 shot and shell at their target. Unfortunately, the British ships were only issued with old-school solid shot and explosive shells, no armour-piercing rounds, and so the Huascar, though much battered, remained largely intact. With night closing in, Shah loosed one of its two brand-new 14-inch Whitehead torpedoes, but it failed to hit. Whether because it just missed outright, or Huascar evaded, remains a matter of discussion in various sources. This was, though, the first combat use of the Whitehead, even if the results were a little bit disappointing. A couple of years later, though, Huascar would feature in the torpedo's story once again. By this point, she was back in Peruvian hands and trying to hunt down the Chilean corvette Abtao. She unleashed a lay torpedo, invented by American John Louis Lay, who'd previously designed the spar torpedo that sank CSS Albemarle. This thing was a truly monstrous weapon, resembling more of a small submersible, being well over 20 feet long and about 24 inches in diameter, something that would not be exceeded for size and diameter combined in regular ship-going service until the Nelson class deployed the 24.5-inch torpedo in the 1920s. By comparison, the largest Whitehead torpedo on offer in this period was about 2/3 the size, and many others were smaller still. The lay torpedo was also remote control, with the steering provided by a pair of electrical wires that paid out as it ran. But, partway to its target, the torpedo reversed course and started heading back at Huascar, the first circular run. Fortunately, a young officer dived into the sea and, with the compressed CO2 engine on its last puffs, simply pushed the errant weapon off course. It missed, was recovered, disarmed, and then taken home. In between these two incidents, the Whitehead had scored its first combat kill. You remember Captain Makarov? Well, his operations against the Ottomans had not just used spar torpedoes, but also kite torpedoes and a small supply of Whiteheads. The kite torpedoes were a variant that had electrical contact detonators as opposed to the mechanical lever detonators on Harvey's design, and as with a lot of 19th century early electrical devices exposed to salt water, they failed to work properly. And to be fair, a lot of electrical devices these days when exposed to large amounts of salt water don't work very well either. The Whiteheads, on the other hand, were launched in a number of ways. The first few were rather less than successful, but in January 1878, two small launches managed to score a hit each on the Ottoman customs steamer Intikba, I think, which sank relatively quickly according to most reports. But the first loss of a warship to torpedoes would have to wait. The 1880s, meanwhile, would see further improvements. Work in the UK by Dr. Froude, one of the candidates for what passes for a patron saint amongst engineers alongside figures such as Brunel, led to the introduction of the blunted nose, the last ingredient to make a weapon look like a full 20th century torpedo. This had two benefits. It was much more hydrodynamic, leading to a slight increase in speed and range, and it also meant a considerably larger warhead could be fitted as there was much more room up front, which increased the torpedo's destructive power. By the end of the 1880s, the Whitehead was being offered in diameters of up to 18 inches, which would remain the standard for most of the rest of the time period that this video is covering. Whitehead's business was expanding as well, with factories opening in France and the UK to keep up with local demand, and of course competitors had begun to emerge. Looking at some of the ones that actually got a fair bit of traction, the lay torpedo we've mentioned earlier. You then have the rather ironically named Schwarzkopf torpedo, which was essentially a pirated copy of a Whitehead. The first version appeared shortly after the titular inventor had visited Whitehead's factory, a visit which just so happened to coincide with a full set of torpedo plans vanishing. The main attraction of the Schwarzkopf torpedoes, other than being an alternate supplier, was that the casing was made entirely out of bronze, which did make them more expensive. 3 Whiteheads could be brought for the price of 2 Schwarzkopfs, but the partially steel Whiteheads needed cleaning and repainting every so often to avoid rust. With that said, in relatively short order, you could also get Whiteheads in bronze, but that was a premium option. On the other end of the cost spectrum was the Howell torpedo from the US. The cheap nature came from the fact that the torpedo ran on the stored energy of a flywheel rather than an engine and a compressed air tank. This made the torpedo weightless since there was no exhaust. It was also the first torpedo to be able to stay on course as well as keep depth, since the big flywheel also acted as a gyroscope. About the only drawbacks to the device were the need to spin the flywheel up before launch, which somewhat delayed the launch itself, and the absolutely awful racket made by the flywheel and the drive mechanism, which rather ruined it as a truly stealthy weapon, especially given how well sound tends to travel underwater. It was driven through the water by two small propellers running side by side in opposite directions instead of having two larger contra-rotating props. Whether fitting sound damping would have helped is something that we'll never know, as unfortunately for the Howl, the larger Whiteheads with extremely high-pressure air tanks began to outrange it soon after its first deployment. As we move on to the 1890s, there's still another step up in torpedo development and the demonstrated capabilities of said torpedoes. 1891 saw the first successful use of a self-propelled torpedo against a warship, when yet another South American civil war, this time in Chile, broke out. The ironclad Blanco Encalada, which had previously helped capture the Huáscar, joined the congressional side of the congressional presidential split, which was what this particular war was all about, alongside most of the Chilean navy. The presidential forces, meanwhile, managed to get a hold of a pair of torpedo boats that were being completed over in the UK for the Chilean navy and used them to attack the old ironclad, sinking her with a single torpedo hit, although it did take them a number of attempts, and the first few torpedoes missed. The captain of Blanco Encalada swam ashore courtesy of his pet llama, which, in a move unusually considerate of llamas, consented to be used as a fluffy flotation device without biting, spitting on, or kicking him much. The next warship to fall victim to torpedoes was another South American ironclad in yet another civil war. Civil wars, you see, were all the fashion in late 19th century South America. You can't really hold yourself to be a proper South American country without at least having had one viciously murderous internal conflict in that time period. In this case, it was Brazil's turn, and the rebel ironclad Aquidaba, which was hit in the bows by two Whiteheads from a loyalist torpedo gunboat, managed to ground herself before sinking, so this time the crew managed to escape without any losses, and the ironclad herself would later be salvaged and returned to service. And for those of you wondering, unfortunately the Bolivian Civil War occurred after Bolivia had lost access to the sea, so the Bolivian Navy was not able to torpedo any of its own ships. Next up was the Sino-Japanese War, 1894 edition. The Chinese Navy once again failed to use their torpedoes particularly effectively, launching many of them when they were still well out of range, and with reports that a Chinese cruiser had been sunk by the explosion of her own on-deck torpedoes, the navies of the world began looking at submerged tubes deep in the ship with great interest. Previously, torpedoes had been launched from cradles on deck, or sometimes from very visible torpedo tubes in the bow and stern, well above the waterline. The Japanese, on the other hand, seem to have had somewhat better results, with several period sources attributing the damage or destruction of at least 4 Chinese ships at the Battle of Weihai Wei to Japanese torpedo boats, albeit none of their targets were moving particularly fast, if at all. A number of them were in fact anchored. 1895 saw the introduction into the Whitehead line of the Aubry gyroscopic guidance mechanism, which now allowed a torpedo to, in theory, self-guide in direction as much as they'd been able to do in depth for several decades. Obviously, the Howl was the first one to do this, but we've already covered that. It also allowed for a course change to be programmed in by a relatively simple timing mechanism which would alter the direction of the gyroscope soon after launch, which was something the Howl couldn't do. This promised much greater accuracy, even if it also meant that you had to install another set of control rudders, this time vertical ones, and after half a decade of further improvements, the gyro was able to reliably stay upright for the whole duration of the torpedo's run, and could be spun up practically instantly on launch. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, there was a brief dalliance into the giant torpedo once again after the abortive Lei attempt, with the Imperial Japanese Navy commissioning an experimental 27.5-inch weapon and a somewhat more commonly used 24-inch version from Whitehead, but these were intended for coastal torpedo defense batteries, not for shipboard use. Going into the 1900s, we see the last stand of the compressed air-powered Whitehead. Although some of this type of propulsion would hang around in various arsenals for years to come, the change was thanks to the Bliss-Levitt Company, which had acquired a franchise of manufacturing rights to the Whitehead torpedo in 1892 and supplied the US Navy with most of its torpedoes thereafter. But in 1904, Frank McDowell Leavitt invented an improved form of propulsion, resulting in the so-called steam torpedo. Rather than simply using compressed air through a reciprocating engine, the Bliss-Leavitt Mark I used pure alcohol mixed with the compressed air to boil water into steam. This was then fed into a miniature turbine to power the propellers. The use of the additional energy afforded to the steam, or in other mechanisms used by competitors to simply heat the air, meant that a torpedo could travel a lot further. Previous Whitehead torpedoes had ranges in the range of about 700 to 800 yards, give or take a little bit. The Bliss-Leavitt could go several thousand yards. This was to be the future of torpedo propulsion. But before this, or variants on this, could become widespread, there was the Russo-Japanese War to deal with. This famously opened with a surprise torpedo attack at Port Arthur, although the net cutters fitted to the Japanese torpedoes to get round the Russian torpedo nets had mixed results. But torpedoes would go on to feature during the rest of the war quite a lot. Over 300 were launched, with a number of ships sunk and still more damaged in various battles, including a number of finishing blows or coups de grace, such as the Russian flagship Kniaz-Suvorov at Tsushima. But, despite their effectiveness when they actually hit, the number of torpedoes that hit versus the number that were launched seemed to indicate that perhaps it was less effective than some had thought before the war, albeit, at the same time, many navies reckoned that this was because the Japanese Navy, needing to conserve its numerically smaller fleet and having had a number of torpedo boats damaged or sunk in the Sino-Japanese War when they got a little close, had tended to fire their torpedoes set at slower speeds, allowing them to go to a maximum range. Higher speed launches at closer ranges, which could be afforded by larger navies that had more torpedo boats to lose, might therefore bring in significantly better results. The overall effectiveness of the threat of torpedoes remained quite high, though, as can be seen via the various shenanigans that ensued in the 2nd Pacific Squadron when a certain repair ship would occasionally ask if anybody could see torpedo boats. The rapid advancement of the heater or steam torpedo continued, but the Whitehead Company itself was no longer independent. Robert Whitehead himself had retired in the 1890s and died in 1905. The majority stake in the company was bought by Vickers and Armstrong, later to be Vickers Armstrong, in 1906, which resulted in the company coming directly under British control, which is where it would remain for the rest of its operational life. By this point, torpedoes were installed on almost every warship worthy of the name, everything from small torpedo boats all the way up to the biggest battleships. And this showed in the various smaller wars that erupted in the run-up to World War I. A lot of torpedoes were launched, and some of them even hit. A couple of examples being that in February 1912, the Italian armoured cruiser Garibaldi sank the Ottoman corvette Avnila on the second attempt, the first having gone off course and accidentally blown up a bunch of small craft nearby. The Ottoman cruiser Hamidaye was damaged by a torpedo hit from a Bulgarian torpedo boat at the other end of the year in November 1912. At this stage, torpedoes of many shapes and sizes were in service. The most common, as we mentioned earlier, were the 18-inch, but there were also larger 21-inch types, or close enough to these sizes for those countries that wanted to be a little bit different and work in metric. 17.7 inches, or 450 millimeters, for example, was a very common torpedo in the German Navy. These weapons, in their various shapes and forms, would now enter World War I, the first large-scale war to see widespread use of heater torpedoes launched from all sorts of platforms, on, below, and above the sea, often with devastating results. But that's about as far as we're going to go in this video. The other somewhat weird and wonderful torpedo dead-end designs, the development of anti-torpedo defences, and of course the development of various torpedo launch platforms and tubes will all have to wait for another day.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.